So how's everybody doing today? Today, I'm going to work on the chainsaw porting class series. If this is your first one, there will be a playlist in the description. You can go back and start at the beginning and watch the whole series. We're a few videos into this now, so if you want to see if you missed anything, going back to the beginning, we are porting a Homelite Super XL Auto, and I'm kind of showing you the process of how I go to do it and some of the decision making in this process. So today, I should say, so up to this point, I've been working on trying to gain your confidence to not be afraid to do this. It's a cheap saw. Don't be afraid, really. That's why we're doing a cheap saw. So I'm hoping to have gained your confidence in your abilities that you might be able to accomplish something like this. So in the last video, my wife was doing the grinding, just to show you that it's not difficult. It isn't. It's more of a confidence thing. So today, I'm going to talk to you about your intakes. I'll explain the reed versus piston ported, but I got some new, what do they call it? They call this contractor paper that I put down on the table to help catch dirt and grease. And it's conveniently a nice piece of paper that I'm just going to draw you a picture here. So let me see if I can capture this. Alrighty. So I picked this paper up just to, catch my grease and dirt and stuff, and I figured, you know what, this makes a good drawing surface too. So we got a little bit of all-in-one here. This is gonna be weird. I'm looking through a camera. So let's just pretend this is our cylinder. Okay, you got intake here, exhaust here. We're talking about the intake today. You'll have your little spark plug up here. You like my spark plug? We're just talking about the intake. So there's three different types of intake. There's a rotary valve, which, let me show you a quick picture here. A rotary valve is basically a disc with a groove caught in it, and as the disc rotates, the intake turns on and off through the groove that's cut into it. That's a rotary valve. You don't see these much anymore. Maybe on some of the go-kart kits or moped kits or something like that. Maybe some of your RC engines might use these. I don't know. But you don't see these much on chainsaws anymore. Another thing is your reed valves, which is basically, imagine your intakes here. You need a valve of some sort to stop the air from moving back that direction. Just something to stop it, okay? And then your piston ported is basically the same thing. So here's your intake, here's your cylinder. The piston, as it comes up and down, shuts this opening on and off. This reed valve, you'll see this in your vintage work, a lot of your vintage saws. The piston ported will be your modern saws, but this isn't always true, because you will see some modern saws that have been converted to reed valve, especially if you get up into the high performance stuff. I think I don't know if he still is, but I know the world record holder was a steel saw with a reed valve intake converted, kind of mess. But basically, that's all the difference is between a piston ported and a reed valve. It's just the method in which it turns the flow on and off. Because as your piston comes down, you're going to build pressure up in your crankcase. And that air pressure is going to want to push back out the intake. So on a piston ported, the piston will come down and shut it off to keep that air from pushing out. Or on a reed valve, you'll have a valve here of some sort to stop it from pushing the air out. Let me show you. Let me show you what a reed valve looks like. I actually have two here, so I can show you. All right, so here's one style of reed valve. Very simple. As the air comes this way, they close, and the air can't get pushed back through. And as your carburetor mounts the bolts onto this side. So as your piston goes up, it starts pulling vacuum down through, and it allows these reeds to open. See? Simple as that. Now I have another one here. It's a pyramid style. I don't have it out of the package. I'm going to leave it in the package. But this is a pyramid style. You can see it. Basically the same thing. Is there a disadvantage or an advantage to reed valves, is what a lot of people say. Well, let me put it this way. Reed valves typically, like I'm showing it here, this is typically the position of your intake on a piston ported saw. Typically your reed's not up here. Usually a reed valve is actually feeding in the crankcase. So your valve would be located down here. So what's advantages and disadvantages? Well, a reed valve is drawing fuel is capable of pulling fuel air mix in the entire time the piston's traveling up through the reed valve. A piston ported has a smaller window of time that it can feed the air fuel mixture. One of the drawbacks with piston ported is if the opening is open too long, you'll start pushing fuel back out to the carburetor, okay? And you don't have that so much with reed valves. It is possible. Some of these old ones, it is possible because they draw just such a huge volume that it's hard to contain it. And the old reed valve systems were not capable of containing so much. So you'll see it on the old ones where they do get what they call spit back. But that's stuff that we here are learning how to fix and improve upon. But the biggest thing with piston ported is if you go too long, you will get fuel coming right back out the intake the wrong direction. And if that happens, it's going to screw up everything, because your carburetor is not going to only be drawing fuel down this way. Like say this is your carburetor, you're not only going to have air coming through this direction, you're going to have it pushing back. And then every time the piston goes up and down, the air is going to want to try to go back and forth and back and forth, and it's going to screw up the way the carburetor wants to feed. So that's the main thing to remember with piston ported saws, is to not have your intake open so long that fuel is pushing back out. Now, there are those people who intentionally install the reed valves on these piston ported engines for the simple fact that they do get more time to draw air fuel mix, because the reed valve will prevent that issue from happening. And that's where you get into the modified work, some of your high performance saws. Like I said, that world record holder, the last time I looked, he was a steel saw with a modification done for a reed valve, and it looked like the reed valve was off a dirt bike or something. It was a pretty heavy duty reed valve, but it gives them more time to draw air and fuel. Personally, I don't think either one is better than the other. They both have their purpose. I like reeds because they feed into the crankcase first. So your air just basically gonna go up and out, where piston ported, you're gonna come down, change direction, and go back out. Reeds do have a reputation of having more torque. That's because the intake timing, remember showing you the degree wheel, you got your intake timing for how long this period is open. Well, on revals, your intake timing is much longer. And on piston ported, it's much shorter. All right, so this is the intake to a Husqvarna 371. Okay. You can see this is the piston ported. This is where the fuel would come down through, or your charge, or however you want to name it. The piston would go up and down. The piston would go up and down inside, turning the flow on and off. Now, I see people do things that I don't typically suggest on these intakes. So let me show you what I'm talking about. Let me draw you another picture. All right, we got a nice clean spot here. So here's your cylinder. Let me find another marker. There's your cylinder. Here's your intake coming in. Okay. You typically have a boot connected right here, and then your carb connected right here. All right. So the smallest opening is usually at your carburetor. That's the area where everything starts. This is typically your smallest part in which air will travel. This is where your air gets compressed, gets mixed with your fuel, and disperses down through. It's got to get through the boot. So it'll start to fan out a little bit as it comes through the boot. It'll get into your intake and run down the engine. But, so let's say this is the end. We're looking straight down in through the intake. Okay. Well, a lot of times your intake will look like this. You might have a bowl hole here and here. And people will see a lot of extra material around here, and they will go in there and start grinding it all out. And next thing you know, you got a huge intake opening right here, right? I see that a lot. But they'll leave the area down by the cylinder pretty much alone. You probably know what I'm talking about. You've probably seen it. So I do not recommend this. And that's because so here's where your air's got to travel. But as the air, let me draw, here's our carburetor. So as the air travels through here, if you open up, so we'll make this our boot area. So if you open up the area, so as your air comes through, if you open up this area, you're going to actually have an opening that goes up to here, like this, for example. And what's going to happen is the air comes through here, it's going to want to come in here and get stirred up. And what it does is it's going to create turbulence right there. Where if you didn't do that, you would have a nice, smooth, straight shot. No turbulence. Personally, I would not open up this hole any bigger than what the boot. Personally, I would not open up this hole any more than what the boot is, the intake boot, or any other mating service that might be there. I would try to keep it as smooth as possible. Keep the transition smooth. If there happens to be a little lip, get it smoothed out. But I do not agree with opening up the intakes like that and creating like a big, it almost looks like a cone by the time they're done. Okay, so instead of having a straight shot in, now they got this cone shape. And this area here, because the boot opening, oops. Okay, so basically what they got is they got this area here, and because of the boot opening only being this big, the air will come in here and start creating turbulence. Personally, I prefer to give my air a nice, smooth, straight path, keep it flowing as fast as possible. That will keep the air atomized quite well. But that's my personal opinion on that subject. Now on reed valves, there's not much to talk about. Just make sure your reeds are functioning proper. Make sure all your mating surfaces are nice and neat and even, and you should be good. Now in reed valve systems, I prefer to keep everything nice. Just keep everything nice and neat and flowing smoothly. Usually not a lot of work in the intakes. The intake is that area where you tend to do the least amount of work. If you do a little too much, it could really hurt you down the road. It could make things go completely bad. Usually that's the one area where the least amount of work you do, the better you're going to be off in the end. If your saw ends up sluggish in the end, if you're talking piston ported, yes, you might need to change your timing 1 degree, which means you're just pulling the opening up at the bottom 1 degree. And when I say 1 degree, I'm talking that's just a couple of thousandths, usually not much. Usually a lot of your intakes will have a little lip at the bottom, just from the casting and the way they make. A lot of times if you just get that little lip out of there and chamfer everything properly, you'll be good to go. A lot of times that's all you have to do. I should say most of the time. You may never, unless you start getting extreme, you may never need to do any more than that. And the reed saws, the biggest thing you can do with the reed saw is just make sure your reeds are functioning properly. All right. And since we're into talking about some airflow, let me just give you a quick bonus here, because we never got into this subject, and that's the transfers. Let me draw you another picture. All right, so just a real quick something about transfers. Just a real quick idea, just to give you an idea of how I look at transfers. And it's simple. You got your top of your transfer. You got the bottom of your transfer. I like the bottom of the transfer to be much, much bigger. If it's bridged, same difference. I like the bottom to be much bigger than the top. I like the bottoms a lot bigger, I should say. I like to have this kind of a shape. What it does is it helps create higher velocity coming out the top of the transfer, and higher velocities help with torque. Just think of it as a pyramid. You know, we want big at the bottom, a place for the air to start gathering. You know, you want your gathering zone to be as big as possible. You gather as much of the charge as possible, and then get it all guided up and shooting out that top like a volcano with as much velocity as possible. That's just how I look at transfers. And the old vintage ones where you got everything is straight, you know, they're the hardest to deal with, getting that shape out of them. Especially whenever you got some of the larger ones that are triple transfer. It's even harder to get it bigger on the bottom than the top. I shouldn't say harder, but it's harder to get it considerably larger on the bottom than the top. It's a velocity thing to me. This is the first video I posted on this in a long time, and I wanted to have a discussion about the intakes. And while I was at it, decided to hit the transfers a little bit. So next time we'll talk about the exhaust some. Maybe do a little exhaust work. But until next time, later.